What exactly is free speech? Can you measure it? And could it be that the current clash between Harvard University and the Trump administration is about free speech? My guest today is an expert in this very field. His name is Dr. Sean Stevens. He is a chief research advisor for the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, which is also known as FIRE. With PhD in social psychology, Sean has spent nearly 2 decades uncovering how our moral beliefs warp our reasoning, especially in politics. His research reveals how universities that once championed open inquiry now routinely silence certain viewpoints. So, Professor Sean Stevens, thank you so much for coming. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on the show.
It is my privilege. Before we dive into, the more philosophical question about what is free speech and how does it differ from hate speech, would you also say that the current clash between Harvard and the Trump administration is not only about anti-Semitism and DEI and federal laws, but it is also in the core about free speech?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's broader than, what's kind of covered or what the main thing that's driving the administration going after Harvard. But I do think there's like longstanding animosity from the Republican Party and the Trump administration in particular at our universities, but in particular the elite ones in the United States.
Okay, so I think which leads me to the idea of free speech. Now, we know and we watched many, I don't know how to call it, yeah, Dave Rubin, Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson news, where you ask students in elite university, elite campuses across the US, are you against free speech? And he says, no, but I'm against hate speech. So, in your perspective, in your opinion, after 2 decades of experience, is there anything like hate speech, or hate speech is just free speech that it is about topics that I'm uncomfortable or against?
I would probably lean towards the latter interpretation you suggested. I think so. I mean, and so this is, in the United States, hate speech is not a thing. I mean, offensive speech is protected by the First Amendment. There are some things that aren't, of course, but generally, what most people would consider a label hate speech is protected in the United States. So it's not even really a legal thing. I think the term gets used and thrown around effectively like you just described. It's used to label speech that I don't like or I'm not a fan of, and I want someone to censor this, so I'm going to call it hate speech, and then try to, in effect, possibly gin up like an outrage mob or just gin up, more attention to the matter and getting more and more people to pressure um, the people, and on college campuses it'll be administrators, but it could be politicians if we're talking about the government, but pressuring the people that can actually censor individuals to do so.
So I think which brings me to the concept of politically correctness and the work of Marcuse, Herbert Marcuse. The idea of politically correctness, when I explain it on my lectures, is that some truths are inconvenient to say, or we forbid to say them because they make people offended. But if your main criteria is not offend people, you will never get to the truth. And I think Marcuse did a great job in exactly this. I want using the politically correctness or the idea of offensive in order to shut you down. And how do you see the concept of politically correctness in the broader context of free speech? And maybe how, in your opinion, how does it correlate to the work of Marcuse?
Yeah, so I think Marcuse effectively, his argument, I mean, you've outlined his argument very well, and it's this like the long march through the institutions and setting up, if you go into like the scholarship in sociology, in the 60s and 70s, there's an interesting um, series of studies on witch hunts and heretics, and how communities effectively label people as witches or heretics and root them out. And this happens in the academia is a community, just like any other. And so what you get is there's acceptable beliefs, there's things you're not supposed to say. But generally, I would think usually like a lot of the time, advances in science, things that cause paradigm shifts, things that revolutionize our knowledge, if we go back to like Thomas Kuhn and his philosophy, they are basically offensive or heretical at the time because they're challenging existing assumptions, long-standing theories that have been accepted. So we need the space for this, and that for a long time is what our universities, purported to provide for scholars. But as the community has become more, I'd say, it's not like politically homogenous, as in like everybody is a communist, the way you might hear on from certain conservative outlets in the US, but it is that the majority of professors are left of center to very left. And there are just certain questions that don't get asked, certain interpretations that aren't offered. And that weakens our ability to get at the truth. One of my best examples, I think, of this is thinking about scholarship on what mode like police shootings. And so in my field in social psychology, there's a lot of studies on the people who may get shot by the police and kind of how they're reasoning about it and what their experiences are. But that's kind of missing half the picture because the other half is the police officers themselves and what their psychology might be.
And again, when you say the major are center to left to extreme left, okay, are inclined
Yeah.
in the university, this is a major. It's not just 52%, okay? It is more
Yeah.
over to the 90%, okay? We don't see Republicans in Silicon Valley, etc. So we can say definitely, and I think one of your work elaborated on this very subject, that basically in many campuses, in certain faculties, like in the humanities, in the Middle
Hmm.
East, you can't see there is just one opinion, which is very similar to the Communist Party, and the letter that the Trump administration sent Harvard University was exactly about the diversity of opinions.
Hmm.
Okay, and so why? If I don't have a diversity of opinions, and I think that this is a very intuitive question, but from a research point of view, why is it so bad that no one challenge
Yeah.
my paradigm?
Yeah. So if we, again, to go back to just general philosophy of science, Thomas Kuhn, scientific method, all these different things, um, the science is never settled. You can always challenge things. You can always come up with things. There's a fallibility in our, I'm a big fan of Karl Popper. And so I like his idea of we're getting closer to the truth by rejecting falsities, right? And that's a lot of what science is hey, like let's see if this holds up. And if it doesn't, we then decide that that's not the way to go. I think over the past decade, a little longer, certainly since the COVID pandemic, that kind of spirit has faded a bit. I mean, this idea that it was, the science is settled, the vaccine works, you won't get sick, you'll never get COVID if you get the vaccine, even though people kind of immediately started getting it after and were using this angle to shut down debate. Um, it's troubling. And in a field, in a scientific field, whatever it is, whether it's a social science, whether it's a hard science, even if it's in the humanities, um, we need to be able to question things. We need to be able to question long-standing assumptions, beliefs, theories. And you need to, yeah, I mean, knowing that you're doing that, you're probably going to be in the minority at first, but the space needs to exist for people to do that. Um, I was getting a little bit at this before. Most people, I wouldn't say everybody thinks exactly the same way in academia. There's gradations of liberalism and left-wing thought, and some are like center left and liberals, closer to classical liberals. Others are socialists, Marxists, etc. So they don't all necessarily agree on everything. but they have a particular worldview that's gonna they're gonna consider certain questions important, other questions not so important. Certain interpretations they're gonna gravitate to with data, other interpretations they're not going to. As someone who's worked with data for over 2 decades, I mean, I could look at something and make one interpretation. You could look at something and maybe come to a different one, and that's totally fine. But we need to recover the space to do that in
Uh,
our
Sean,
cities. Yeah.
with your permission, I would like to give a recent Israel example to
Yeah.
what you
Go
just
ahead.
said. And there is a term, a new term coined in Israeli media, which is a conception. Now, we know the term conception, but we call it in Hebrew the conceptia. And the idea of the conception that in prior to October 7th, we didn't think differently. And I had a conversation with a psychologist that trained people in the Israeli intelligence to, to track those people cited and listened to the Arabs in Gaza. And
Mhm.
they viewed what they heard just from their liberal, secular perspective. So no one said, no one questions the idea that maybe money will not be beneficial here. Maybe it's not about money. Maybe it's about something that they don't understand. The idea of if we all agree, if we all look from the very same perspective, no one can challenge it. And October 7 was a huge breaking of the conception. Okay. And I think this strikes me again to uh, my culture. But what you just said, the idea of falsify, that you need a way to distinguish good theories from bad theories, I think leads me to the idea of Marxism, because there is no way that you can say that Marxism is good based on the historical evidence. From an economic point of view, it has been disproven completely throughout the 20th century and 21. And one can see what Javier Milei does in Argentina nowadays. That no, the exact opposite works. Marxism fails all the time, and the works of Tom Sowell, etc. So if I persist with keeping the ideology of Marxism, maybe this is not about the idea of the scientific methods. Maybe it's like an ideological mental illness. So could you please elaborate on the concept of how do we stick with such
Yeah.
wrong ideologies?
Yeah, so some of that'll come more out of my social psychological, political psychology work and less of necessarily what I do at Fire. But my kind of major background in that field is in John Haidt's moral foundations theory. And so this theory proposes that, there are a core set of moral foundations, and they're like taste buds almost, or they're like volume dials on a like a audio recording device, right? Like you can turn for some people, some of these are turned really up high, and other ones are turned down low. For other people, maybe they care about all of them. Um,
And
these
liberals don't understand three of them, just don't understand three of them.
Yeah, well, and so we've revised the theory, over time and kind of proposed a couple new foundations and things like that. But yeah, I mean the left liberal moral foundations are essentially basically like two of the five or six that we propose exist. And then more conservative individuals tend to have it's not that they don't care about the liberal values, it's that they also care about the other values.
But again, sorry to interrupt. The
Yeah,
idea
go
is,
ahead.
and please correct me if I'm wrong. The idea of with Hyde theory is that Republicans or conservative can understand the motives for liberals. They can
Yep.
understand the two. But liberals, for example, cannot
Yeah.
understand, they cannot grasp the idea that there are other dials as well, which are also important.
Yeah, no,
Therefore,
that
they
is
treat conservative as bad people.
That's exactly right. Conservatives, because they still also place a high value on the two foundations liberals very much emphasize, have a typically, on average, would you'd predict have a better understanding of the liberal worldview, and they're not as likely. I mean, you can watch some conservative media that they call liberals. They call it a mental illness too. But in general, I would say the majority of them, though, do have a better understanding of the liberal worldview than vice versa. And you do see a lot in the United States in your more liberal left media, this idea that conservatives are just horrible people who, there are some theories in my field of social psychology that I would say kind of almost suggest this too. But yeah, it suggests that having conservative views is a mental illness, which I would not agree with. Basically, it's like you might not agree with their views, but it's not a mental illness. It's people have different ways of getting to what they think is a good, caring society.
And I think that Jonathan Haidt had like writing this book, he had an epiphany. So he finally understood it. It dawned on him that those people are not bad.
Yeah,
So in my question is, how can we duplicate the epiphanies that Jonathan Haidt had during the writing of the book? How can we say, okay, listen, you need to think of it from this perspective, or take this analogy or this analogy, and then maybe you will have this like new epiphanies. Ah, so there is another orthogonal way looking into this reality.
I can go and I can even just bring in my own personal experience on this as someone who entered. I mean, now I'm in my 40s now, so we're going back like 20, 25 years when I entered college. But I entered college and I was definitely a very what you would consider a very liberal left person. Um, 9/11 happened my sophomore year. I was very opposed to the Iraq War. I was very anti the George W. Bush administration. But I also, through circumstances, wound up living with a conservative Republican for 2 years in college. And we're close to this day. I was the best man at his wedding. So I think right here, it's just knowing people who maybe have these different views and you get along with them in other domains. And then maybe, oh, you find out that they have this political view you disagree with or that political view, but it's like, they're a good person. You get along in a lot of other domains. It helps to start opening the mind a little bit, I think.
Maybe
Um,
maybe we put it mandatory, you need to one liberal student, one conservative student, and you get the discount in the dorms.
the libertarian streak within me doesn't want to mandate anything like that, but I do think it's valuable. It's being exposed to people that I think what happens on both sides of the aisle in the United States. I can't speak much to how it might be in Israel, but in the United States, I think there are people on the left, there are people on the right who have such a caricatured view of what the people on the other side think, and they don't really ever talk to them. And then it's like once you do, you realize, wait, they're not so crazy. This person's not this crazy caricature that I think they are, and they actually have a lot of reasonable beliefs, even though we might disagree on this here and that here and this minor thing over here. And that can really change how you, I think, see people and interact and your open-mindedness.
Okay, so with your permission, my next question will be, how symmetrical is it? And let me quote Elon Musk. Elon Musk said, I didn't change my mind. It is just that the left become far more left than it used to be, and the right didn't, shift so much to the right. The main radicalization was in the left camp, not in the right camp. So, from your experience, would you say that the Musk statement is factually correct? That we see more left radicalization than right?
I think he's onto something. I would go a little more nuanced there, where I think if you, and this depends on where you want to put the timeline of when the radicalization of either side started. I actually think there's probably there's not probably there's pretty good evidence that the right radicalized a bit first, and then I think in response, particularly to like the Bush era, the second Bush era, and then when the Obama era, the left kind of radicalized more during then. And so if you're looking over the past like 10 to 15 years, I think you see more of like the left moving very far out and becoming more radical than the right. But if you go back further, you can see some of it happening on the right as well. Um, yeah, I'd leave it there. There's more, but we can get into that later.
Okay. Now, there is one thing that it is, I think, in my mind, is very interesting. Your research shows that stronger civic knowledge correlate with a greater political tolerance. And my question is, why do you think that our educational system has failed, or the American educational system failed to produce civility literate graduate? And what's the psychological cost of this failure? Okay, because there is like some books about the dumbest generations that most American students, most young Gen Z thinks that Russia was in war against the US in World War II, etc., etc. But how the idea of being literate with civil history can change, or how the failure of teaching this uh, caused the scenarios that we are in today.
Yeah, so well, I think on the knowledge part, having knowledge of civic values, just general American civics, but also of American history, world history, it gives you a broader perspective. I think, like you mentioned, you have students today entering college being like, yeah, Russia was fighting the US in World War II, which I mean, I, I I don't know where they got that idea from, but no, but I think like having knowledge of history allows you to see things like when the news media is doing what they I think usually do and like overreacting to the news of the day and declaring something unprecedented. Well, knowledge of history usually points you to, no, this has kind of happened before. Maybe not exactly in the same way, but I can think of numerous instances where something like this has happened before. So this isn't unprecedented. Maybe we should take a step back and calm down and think about this a little bit more. Um, so that's the knowledge part. I think that it just gives people a broader perspective on things and the ability to possibly do that. In terms of why it's declined, I mean, it's fairly, I think it's fairly well documented. American education, the K through 12 system has increasingly spent more and more money and gotten less and less return. And a lot of this is devaluing and de-emphasizing teaching of some of these topics as not as important as other things.
Let me give you my perspective, and
Yeah,
please,
love to
I'm
hear it.
not an American, I'm not an expert in the
Yeah.
K-12 system, etc. But Edward Gibbon in The Decline of the Roman Empire says that the decline started when the Roman Empire stopped believing in its own values.
Mhm.
And maybe the decline of the US educational system is strongly connected with the idea of stop believing in the right values, that the we are going to be the best nation ever. And my you know consecutive uh, thought on this subject it that it is closely related to the idea of stop teaching the Bible in the Supreme Court 68 case, that you cannot teach the Bible, you cannot teach the values that the United States, that the founding father built their nation upon. So this is my two thoughts, and
I,
you can make them separate. But do you think that the current educational systems has stopped believing in the US values of the Bill of Independence, for example?
Yeah, I think I would say, I don't know if I would say stopped believing in it. I think what I would say is it's become far more critical of the United States and its history. I mean, critical theory rose out of Mark Hughes, is who we talked about a little bit before, and he wrote a lot of his major stuff in the 60s. And so I think a lot of this did start in the late 60s, early 70s. There was shift to like changing education, doing the education system differently. But also the rise of critical theory and essentially being like, no, like America's not a good nation and we shouldn't be so patriotic and all of these things. Um, Along with that would come with perhaps de-emphasizing Judeo-Christian values in the classroom. Yeah, I think that's probably a fairly good read. I would just say I think it's more that it's become just more, not that they reject them or hate them or don't think that those should be values. I think it's just that they're far more critical of America and American history in general and capitalism. That's just become more in vogue, a sense, and a popular position in K through 12 education and in the universities here.
It is far more critical, far more cynical,
Yeah.
and again, the one of the books I think that encapsulate the idea is Howard Hughes' The People History of the United States.
Yep.
So basically, all states, all nations had slavery. The United States was the first nation to have the abolition of slavery or giving rights to women. It's not that we are bad in one thing. There is like a almost a psychopath resentment, as Nietzsche described it, against the values, against our nation. It's not our nation. It's the nation, the worst nation ever. I recently watched Am I Racist by Matt Walsh. And
Mhm.
the way they speak, the people there, the way they speak about the greatest country ever existed on planet Earth is something beyond imagination. You can't even grasp how on earth could you look at the United States and see what you just said. I think it just be, I cannot understand it. I am speechless.
I think there's, and so I'll get a little social psychological here and draw on some stuff that I did back when I was in grad school. But I think there's a scholarship on this concept of collective guilt and less scholarship on it, but still a decent amount on collective shame. And so but the collective term in front of both of these means that you yourself don't actually have anything to feel guilty over or shame over as an individual. It's nothing that you actually did, but you feel it on behalf of a group you strongly identify with. Right. And so and in this scholarship, this doesn't get played up a lot in the scholarship, but the correlation is there almost in every article. People who experience collective guilt and collective shame are more politically liberal than politically conservative.
And there are no redemption for WASP. There are no redemption for white privileged men. Okay,
Yeah.
many people
But yeah,
say
so
that that uh, the operations when they change a boy into a girl are only operated on white men. So the only way to redeem your sin is to castrate yourself. It's like idolatry. You need to get a human sacrifice, and the
yeah, I
human
mean,
sacrifice is
there's a lot of these like symbolic
yes.
actions that are done. But I want to just go back to the guilt shame thing for like a second. What this actually does is the experiences of collective guilt makes people want to air something, so we'll be more supportive of things like reparations now or this or that. The collective shame aspect, there's a link in clinical psychology called the shame rage spiral. So it's like you feel shame, you get angry, and you start lashing out. And so I think that kind of, again, like Don, this is the scholarship doesn't necessarily test all this, but kind of the relationships are there, the correlations are there, and you can see it. And I think that that is a little bit of what's going on for sure with people on the left. It's like they feel ashamed of what they think American history is and how the country is and what it does. And then there's like a lash out. There's like this shame spiraling into anger and rage.
Now, I want to focus on the idea of shame and ask you from a different perspective, the gender, okay? And this is a hard question, but nevertheless, we must ask it. Jordan Peterson, in his final study before he left the University of Toronto, initiated a study about how do you identify the probability of someone becoming a woke, or how can you predict it? And he had like four criteria. One was four criteria that increases tremendously the probability of a student being a woke. One is being a woman or having a female personality, being exposed to at least one woke courses, and low verbal intelligence. And Quillette recently showed that the dramatic gap that opened between male and female political opinions also correlate with like what Jonathan Haidt said about the assertment of social media has dramatically affected female mental health. And my question is, when you compile all those components together, ideology, mental health, and gender, what you get is that the rise of recent years of, for example, left-wing authoritarian is simply a deep deterioration in female mental health across the globe. Would you agree with this statement?
I mean, I think the data supports that interpretation for sure. And I think when you, if we're going to think back to like the college campus setting, the universities, things like that, if we go back 40 years to the 1980s or so, the percentage of undergraduate, the breakdown gender-wise was about 57% male, 43% female. Today that's reversed. So some of the things on campus with calls for censorship, some of these other things, you could see the increase in that being somewhat due to that. There's also 7 to 8 decades of research on political tolerance that shows on average men are typically going to be more politically tolerant of po political views and people that they disagree with than women. And so I think you're seeing a lot of that play out on the campuses today. So yeah, I think that there's plenty of data to support that assertion.
Could you please, without being too much into the stereotypes of men versus
Yeah.
women, could you please explain, in your opinion, how do you perceive this gap that opened between male and female? And I think that the recent Quillette article of the recent Quillette research showed like a, just a huge gap between women tendency towards work and men tendency towards work. How can we explain it based on the psychology
Yeah.
of men versus women?
So I think that goes to if you go into psychology and this is not like yes, some people might present these as like gender stereotypes, but in social psychological data, personality psychology, this is fairly well supported. Men are interested in things, women are interested in people. There's clear preferences that the genders have. Women tend to be more aggressive. When they're aggressive, it's aggressive emotionally, whereas men are physically aggressive. Like they get into fights with each other.
I have two
Um,
boys and two girls. Tell me about
yeah,
it.
yeah. No, and so and this comes from some of the work that John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, our president, did on coddling of the American mind. It's in that book, but when men or boys or men have a disagreement, like they fight it out, and then it's kind of over after that, and maybe you don't go back to being friends, but it's over. It's past, and they're not so much going after each other's reputations, or they're going after their emotions or things like that. Whereas aggression and nastiness from young girls, females, women it tends to be more relational. It tends to go more after the person, and it's not as physical. And as John's pointed out, a lot of times it's like the social media is just set up to, in effect, keep women, they're able to keep doing this all day. They can keep taunting each other as you leave school, as you're home, whatever. And the boys and the young men are like playing video games together and
But
still doing homework.
but I still didn't understand why what you said about, and there are clearly distinguishable differences between men and
Yeah.
women. But how do those differences affect the tendency of women to be more woke oriented? Is it because woke ideology is more towards protecting the weak, or and women have more tendency to protect and care and
Yeah, I mean, if you want to link it again back to like our moral foundations discussion and things, that yeah, there's going to be more of a tendency for females, women to be high on the care harm foundation, to be high on the equality foundation, and they're motivated by preventing harm to people, by caring, more motivated. It's not, men are also motivated by these things, but it's maybe not the top thing for them, right? The top thing for them might be independence or fairness, as like not everybody gets the same results, but fairness is like, oh, you put in a lot of effort, you get out more, something like that. Yeah, I mean, I think it does it I think it goes all together. And then when you bring in some of the long-running findings with political tolerance, as we've been talking about this whole time, a lot of this ideology is about censoring views you don't like. And the political tolerance literature suggests that on average, women are going to be more willing to do that than men.
again, I want to give a recent example from
Yeah.
my country, which is a very interesting country nowadays. And there is a very harsh, very emotional debate between the right and the left in Israel nowadays regarding how do we treat Hamas. And there is like a huge, we are going to invade Gaza once again in the following days. And the idea is that many people in the right say, listen, the left wings in Israel, the Jewish left wings, are willing to negotiate with Hamas, willing, negotiate with Hamas, for the hostages, or just, we can't be in war. We need to end this war. But they don't have this tolerance toward their Jewish brothers from the right, which again
Mhm.
I think is a repeating motive in the woke ideology. You have tolerance just to one very specific group, and all the other group, the privileged group, you have no tolerance whatsoever. Okay, and again, the idea of women tend to care more. Woke ideology is not about care more. Woke ideology, to some extent, is about doing whatever you need to do in order to shut down the bad guys, or to shut down the guys outside this group that you aim to help.
Yeah,
So
which they will see as providing care and preventing harm and will use that language, but the motive is probably more what you just described for sure.
this is so strange. Now, there is, no, okay. Now, there is one thing, and we just talk about, there is like the concept of authority, or just a second, I can do it. Authoritarian, okay?
Yeah, authoritarianism.
being
Yeah.
being Israel is very hard. Authoritarian. Now there is left wing authoritarians and right wing authoritarians, and I think that you elaborated on the concept of left wing authoritarians. So why can't we? And again, we just mentioned the idea of left wing authoritarians recently. Why can't we just say authoritarians? How, in your perspective, left wing authoritarians are profoundly different than right wing authoritarians? And could you please give a living example to a person or a group
Yeah.
that you consider right-wing authoritarians versus left-wing authoritarians?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of similarities for sure. There are. But there are differences in how they manifest. I think a clear way to distinguish them is a right-wing authoritarian is going to be supportive of like a singular dictator figure, right? Like an autocrat or a dictator figure. So according to people on the left, that could be someone like Donald Trump or Viktor Orban. It could be Putin, but it's like a singular figure, right? Whereas I think left-wing authoritarians, it's not so much necessarily about a singular figure, but it's more like a totalitarian state that they're in support of, right? So both of these things kind of are doing the same thing. They're controlling people in an authoritarian way, but in the right-wing version, it's like the one person leading it. In the left-wing version, it's like a whole government or state of people doing it. So it's more than one, effectively. And I think that's, that's, I think, the best way to maybe distinguish how they're different. And then like I'll be honest, it's like there's a lot of similarities. They're just targeting each other. Right? Like the left-wing authoritarians are going after the conservatives, and the right-wing authoritarians are going after the liberals that they don't like. So
Would you consider, and I'm sorry to use name, but I need a concrete example. Would you
yeah,
consider Bernie Sanders, for example, to be a left-wing authoritarian?
I don't think I would put Bernie Sanders there. I think probably the Chinese Communist government, the Chinese Communist Party is a better example of that. I mean, I know
Okay,
that
so
that maybe blurs the lines a little bit because Xi is
if you give me the
obviously,
Chinese government versus I don't know Germany neo-Nazi or a fascist that support Viktor Orban,
yeah.
it I think that you are giving yourself very easy life. Okay, the idea is that how do left wing versus right wing authoritarianism manifest in the United States? Not just,
Okay, yeah. So
let me give you like a very a very far away example about communist China. Okay, because we see those ideologies, we see those kind of behavior within the United States nowadays. So in your okay, so if you want, I can phrase it differently. What are the manifestation of versus right wing authoritarianism in the United States?
okay, so one manifestation that we kind of experienced, I would say, fairly recently is so one of the three facets of left-wing authoritarianism is top-down censorship. So kind of a controlled censorship apparatus run by the government. I think reporting by Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger and some other people have shown that was in place during the Biden administration. I'm not saying like Joe Biden himself is a left-wing authoritarian, but those practices are very consistent with it, effectively. So that would be one example of how it manifests. And then like within that, you've got the press in the US is a lot like colleges and universities where there's, a very dominant political perspective or viewpoint. And so it's almost like you don't have to it doesn't necessarily have to be fully directed. It's like, but they're going to go along with it because they kind of agree with censoring those views. So that's certainly one way it would manifest in the US, something like that.
I would say, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that you can see or witness censorship in this level only in the left liberal wing. Mark Zuckerberg, in a recent Joe Rogan interview, said that the Biden administration during the COVID pandemic said, please don't, I think, no, he didn't say please. He said, don't, uh, 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 don't put online nothing against the vaccine, nothing against the vaccine. And from what I get from the last Trump administration, from the current
Hmm.
Trump administration, and I consider myself to be a conservative right-oriented person, we don't see this kind of censorship in the conservative part. The idea of free speech is more inherited, uh, 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 is more natural to conservative to right-wing people. Now, as a professor for speech for free speech, do you also share this view?
I think it's probably a little more complicated than that. I think again, it kind of depends on how far back we go historically or things like this. But in the 80s and early 90s, I would say certainly the religious right in the United States was far more censorious than anyone on the left. But things changed.
1990s,
Yeah,
1990s
the
or
80s and
1890?
80s and early 90s, 80s and kind of early 90s. I'm sure there was stuff with campuses then too, but I
Can
mean,
you
we
give a
have,
concrete example? It's not like the ape trial. We are talking about 1990. Okay, could you have just one concrete example about how the religious
yeah,
right?
like the obsession over rap lyrics in the 90s. There was big deal over the violent lyrics in rap music and heavy metal music, and the heavy metal is devil worshippers and this or that. And if you play the records backwards, it has satanic messages. So, that happened, sure. But I think as time has gone on, and certainly over the past 10 to 15 years, you've seen far more of the censorship come from left of center people in the United States. Um, on a number of different topics. Um, so it waxes, I think it waxes and wanes, and yes, now I would say I think your assessment it seems largely correct that people on the right in the United States are a bit more open, a bit less censorious of left-wing views than vice versa.
But again, nowadays,
You
and
could tie this back to
if we
Heights
go
theory
backwards,
again.
okay,
You could
okay,
tie this back to Heights theory again because they have a better understanding of all the foundations, so they might
it
just be more open to hearing.
okay. Now,
Yeah.
again, it's the idea of censorship. Again, everything is strongly connected to free speech, but many institutions claim that they support free speech, but they need to prioritize safety or create a
Mhm.
welcoming or safety environment. And and this is, I think, the climate nowadays in university campuses that we need to also address the concept of a safety environment. Now, people can say, listen, university is not about being in a safe environment. University is about rocking your world. Okay, if you are a religious person and go to study for example, the history of religion, you are going to be shocked. And this is the main goal of university to shake your prior non-questionable beliefs. Okay, now what with your advice to universities in the US today, do we need to address at all the idea of safety or safe environment or welcoming environment? Or do we need to just cancel or tweak it a little bit? Just say that, I want in my university to promote free speech, okay, to go higher on your index. Do you think that I also need to take into account the idea of safety and welcoming environment?
I think they need to take it into account the main reason would be because students are arriving at college with these ideas. So they need to take it into account for that reason. I would suggest that they try to, for the most part, largely dispel that notion and effectively be like, hey, you're now in a college or university. The idea of this space is we're gonna have hard conversations. There might be things you don't like. There might be things you have strong reactions to, but also this is it's a controlled environment, right? Like the professor is going to moderate the discussion. Like this is still probably the safest way to have these conversations because you can get out in the world and who knows who you're going to wind up talking to, and you're not going to have a lot of control over that setting in the local bar or at the sports game or in your church or whatever it is, right? Like, so I would want them to just they can't ignore that notion that students are probably coming to school with that notion, but I would want them to maybe try to dispel it.
Okay, very, very nice. Now, you have like a free speech index, the Mountain Index, I
Yep.
think. How do you call
So
it?
we have it's a college. We have two different things. We have a college free speech rankings where we rank colleges and universities in the United States, how good they are for free expression for primarily for their undergraduate students. Um, the majority of that comes from a survey that we do every year of undergrads. But we also factor in the outcomes of speech controversies on campus. So we maintain multiple databases on our website. We have a campus deplatforming database that it tracks some attempts to get speakers who are invited to campus, have them canceled from giving their speech. It could be play performances, movie screenings, artwork, all things like that would go in this database. We have what we call Scholars Under Fire, which is mostly faculty, but it could be postdocs and PhD students too. So it's basically anyone who's like an academic and teaching, and they get targeted for something they've done in that space. And we're about to launch in a couple weeks what we're calling Students Under Fire, which is the equivalent of the Scholars one, but it's for individual students and student groups. So the outcomes of these controversies factor into our rankings. So do policies that schools have on the books. So they have different speech policies. We give them different ratings for that. And then schools can also adopt things like institutional neutrality, the Chicago Statement principles. So they get bonuses or penalties based on how these things shake out.
And
Um,
what is the motivation for an institution to go higher on the free speech ranking? So it is not a federal thing. You don't give federal
yeah,
money. So what is the motivation for an organization to even
I mean,
participate?
so we're trying to give students, parents, alumni, faculty, any interested party an assessment of the climate on these campuses. Um, they basically, if it's like if you look bad, it, people might, people who are prioritizing free speech, free expression in their academic experience are going to choose like your rival who does a lot better over this. Notoriously, and I'll even extend back a little further because I think most people have, heard about how Harvard's been really bad in our rankings the last few years. Like that's shown up a lot. But I'll reiterate, Columbia was also really bad last year, and the year before the year before Harvard first was ranked last, Columbia was last. I actually think Columbia is probably going to be last again this year for a lot of what they've done recently. Um, but it's not a good look. We've had universities contact us, and they don't want that stigma of being labeled bad on free speech, bad on free expression. We've had a handful of schools contact us, work with us to reform policies, take some suggestions, and they've risen in the rankings as a result. And
This is
not just
great.
because they changed the policies, the student response has improved as well.
So
Right.
my question will be, how did the October 7 events affected this ranking? Because from what I understand in the Columbia versus Harvard examples that you gave, we knew in advance that free speech was a very uh, problematic, both at Columbia and Harvard University,
Yeah.
and we knew it before October 7, and this is what caused the chanting and all the protest in after October 7. So we didn't see any change. And what was before October 7 was after October 7. But did you see anything that some university decreased dramatically, decline in the free speech
Yeah.
index, and
Yeah. Yeah.
some universities increased dramatically after October 7? So
Yeah.
what was how October 7 affected this index across the
Yeah.
US?
So there's a few ways. There's definitely a few ways. So the survey was in the field. So last year, the survey is in the field now for this year's rankings, which come out in September. So we basically put it in the field every spring semester. So it was in the field when the encampment protests started last year, right? And then we can also do a comparison of last year to the year prior, because the year prior was collected before October 7th happened.
Okay.
So few things we've seen are in 2023 when we did the survey, which, like I said, was done in the spring, so it's pre-October 7th. About a quarter of students said the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was difficult to discuss. So like it's a notable portion, but it wasn't one of like the top issues that students were identifying. That those were more like abortion, race, transgender rights, gun control, immigration, things like that were all identified by more students as difficult to discuss. Um, then last year when we asked this question every year, 56% of students said Israel-Palestine conflict was difficult for them to have an open and honest conversation about. That's a record high in the 5 years that we've done the survey. The previous high was like 52% for race, I think after in 2021 with George Floyd. So that right there is an indicator that clearly that's become the dominant issue or the most difficult issue to discuss on a lot of campuses. What we've seen since then in terms of speech controversies are both pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian students are trying to get, you know, speakers they don't like canceled, but they're going about it in different ways. The pro-Israeli students they're appealing to the administration to cancel the speaker. They'll write petitions, etc. Um, but if the university doesn't give in to the demands and the speaker comes to campus, they're generally able to speak and the events are not disrupted. Um, Pro-Palestinian students do the same things as the pro-Israeli students. They try to get speakers they don't like canceled, etc. Um, but they're far more likely to then, when that speaker is not canceled, to just try to disrupt the event and even successfully disrupt the event. Uh, we're also seeing things like speakers who have any kind of affiliation with Israel are being shouted down. So one example that sticks in my mind is a professor of, I think it was like astrophysics, who's going to UNLV to give a lecture on black holes, was shouted down because he works at an Israeli university. Um, so that, to me, that's like that's kind of excessive. And then more in particular, in terms of just how this affected schools in the rankings, um, we, because the survey was in the field when the encampment protests started last spring,
Mm.
uh, we were able to, well, we reopened it on every campus. Once they started, we reopened the survey on every campus that it had closed on, to collect more responses. But that allowed us we basically got a naturalistic experiment and we could do a pre-post test. And so what we saw was students at schools like Columbia, schools like Barnard, schools like Indiana, University of Texas in Austin, all of which had these heavy-handed responses to the protests. Student evaluations of the administration plummeted. So we have a couple questions where we ask students what they think about their administration. Do they defend free speech on your campus? Are they likely to? Are their opinions on this issue clear? And so basically, Columbia and Barnard were already doing pretty badly on these beforehand, and they just went into the gutter afterwards. And so, yeah, it's schools like Harvard, schools like Columbia, schools like NYU, where a lot of controversies happened, whether it involved faculty, whether it involved students, speakers, etc. They all took a pretty serious hit.
I,
And
I
take that as validating of the rankings in some way, like honestly.
I have two questions. One,
Yeah.
regarding the administration, the management of the universities. Would you see the way they treated the protest, the Jewish students, etc., is just cowardness? Is it just uh, being afraid of the protest? Or would you consider this more towards an ideology? We know that, Alan Gerber recently said that Harvard is a very serious issue with anti-Semitism. Okay?
Mhm.
So uh, how much is cowardness and how much is no, no, no? It's just about
I,
ideology.
I do think it's a mix of both. It's hard to say how much is, one, how much is the other. There's probably some other factors in there for sure. Um, but I do think it's probably a mix of both. And I would the thing with college and college university administrators, at least here in the United States, and this probably holds true elsewhere, but I'll limit it to what I know the best, which is here. Um, the thing that they're like generally most scared of is bad PR. So they're probably scared of the protests because it's going to give them bad PR, and then they're scared of, and then they don't handle the way Jewish students are being canceled not canceled, treated on campus well because they're afraid of bad PR. They're afraid of blowback for being seen favoring one side versus the other. So I think that
Sean, I cannot think of
there's cowardice, but that's what
You
it
know,
is. It's like
I
they don't
cannot
want to look
think
bad.
of worse PR than what Harvard University and Columbia University and Penn
I agree.
got in the last year. So
I agree.
the idea of bad
I
PR
agree.
is so funny. Now, and the second question is you distinguish between the pro-Israeli or the pro-Jewish and the pro-Palestinian students, how they treat or how they act when what they want is not achievable when the administration doesn't want to shut down a speaker. And I think that I know what are the roots for this difference. Okay. In your
Mhm.
opinion, what are the roots? Why the pro Palestinian students and protesters act the way they do, and the pro Israeli protesters act the way they do?
I think it probably comes down to, on some level, some differences in the moral foundations and what's emphasized. I mean, I see a lot of the pro-Palestinian movement on campus, whether it's students, faculty, et cetera. It's very affiliated with the left, with woke ideology, like we've been discussing. It's a thing that I've often wondered about because, I mean, you know, trans students for Palestine doesn't make a lot of sense to me because if those students went to Gaza, I don't think they'd enjoy their experience there. Um, so I think a lot there's the worldview it gets pulled into this, and I think I mean, with the Jewish perspective, you have a culture that has long had to be tolerant and
And cherish
accepting.
the debate, and cherish the
Yeah,
conversation,
and has long
and
been
cherish the
scholarly and academic.
disagreement.
Yeah, and has long been that, and that's, rabbis, religious leaders are also teachers, and they're supposed to engage in this type of approach. And so there's a very different mindset, I think, coming from one side versus the other for sure.
I think, transfer Palestine, students who chant transfer Palestines, it is all about stupidity. But their professors not telling them that what they're doing is just illogical and stupid, this is moral corruption. And I think this is what inside the inherit of the current clash between Harvard University and the Trump administration. If you really cannot distinguish between what's happening right now in Gaza, which is awful, and true genocide,
Yeah.
between, I don't know, uh, Israel being the most delicate, precise army ever existed on planet Earth, and what Candace Owens said about blowing up babies. So if you cannot distinguish between right and wrong, even not on the moral level, but on the logical, rational level, there is a very big corruption in those institutions. And my question to you, and I think that the only thing that can cure it is free speech, and this is what Fire does in the last How many years?
Fire was founded in 1998, so it's about
Okay,
27
so 27. So,
now or so. Yeah.
so my last question is, having said all of this, and after our entire wonderful, interesting, mind-blowing conversation, how do you see the future? Can the elite university, can US campuses be healed from this mental illness and promote again the idea of reason and free speech and debate in safe environments? Or just like in the Harvard Trump, they're going to sue the Trump administration, they're not going to negotiate, and if you touch just a single hair for my hair, I will go to fight against you because this is my freedom, this is my academic freedom, and I will put inside the bag of academic freedom whatever I want. So how do you see the next 5 years or the next four
Hmm.
years?
Yeah, so I think it probably, if it's repairable, fixable, it takes longer than that. But I'm not entirely sure if it is, to be honest. I'd like to hope that it is, and I think, but it's going to take strong leadership. It's going to take strong leadership from places like Harvard and Columbia and UPenn, because they are seen as the elite, and where they lead, most people follow, right? Like if they adopt something, most other schools are going to follow their lead and do it. So I think it requires some strong leadership from our elite universities, many of which right now, yeah, probably leave a lot to be desired when it comes to free speech, free expression, academic freedom, open inquiry, promoting all of those things.
Okay, I wish. Professor Sean Stephen, thank you so much for your time and for your effort and for your amazing work conducted over the past 2 decades. Let's say that someone has heard our conversation up until now and he wants to read more about the subject of free speech and
Yeah.
the thing that FIRE does. Could you recommend like one or two books about the subject, about free speech, about the importance of free speech, about the radicalization, about whatever you want, books uh, that can elaborate on the subjects that we touched upon.
Yeah, so I would, first I would say you could check out thefire.org, which is our website. You could find a ton of resources there. But in terms of books that I would recommend picking up, there's uh, Free Speech: A History by Jacob Mishingama, which basically traces the development and free expression, free speech from the ancient Greeks all the way through to today. And it'll hit on, scholarship all over the world, basically, and history all over the world with this. So that's one I would recommend. There's our President Greg Lukianov's most recent book that he co-wrote with Ricky Schwartz, so that's Canceling of the American Mind. I think that gives a very good take on basically the last decade or so on campus and what's been going on. Some other books are I'm looking over at my bookshelf, so you can
Okay.
see. But there's Dangerous Ideas by Eric Berkowitz. And then a classic that I would certainly go back to and that I love is Karl Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies.
Yeah,
Very
definitely.
thick read, very, very long read. It's like
You
over
will
1,000.
never, you will never think, you will never think about Plato. You will never think about Plato. Uh,
Same way
the
again.
Yeah, the same way again after reading the Open Society. You know, Marx, you come to the Open Society with like a very strong notion about Marx, but about Plato, wow, it just blew your mind.
Yeah, it
And
blows your mind. It
yes,
does. Yeah, so
democracy
those
is
are,
overrated.
there's others, but I would start there probably. Those seem like some pretty good ones. And then if you want to go back a bit further, There's a great book from the early 90s by the late Nat Hentoff, First Amendment attorney in the US. Free speech for me, but not for thee.
Oh, do as I do, do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah,
Prof-
basically.
Professor Sean Stephen, thank you so much. It's been an honor
You're
and privilege
welcome.
speaking with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was a good time.
Okay, bye bye.